All right. My microphone's on, and I just talked loud, which means that we are live. So if you're online, hello, and welcome back to our fourth and final week of the Build Seminars on Parables. My name's Tim Peace, and here's the news. I'm just kidding. All right. We got friends in the room here. How you guys doing? We've been chatting before, so I'm not going to pretend that we weren't already talking before you were watching online. But anyway, I told you last week we were going to be putting things a bit out of order, and it wasn't as much for rhyme or reason as it is that I like to save the most well-known for last. Although there's probably competition for the most well-known Jesus parable, I would say there's probably a top three. In no particular order, I'd say the parable of the sowers is pretty well, or the sower and the seed and soils, pretty well known. I'd say the parable of the Good Samaritan is pretty well known. In fact, in week 1, I accidentally said Good Samaritan when I was talking about the prodigal son. That's how fresh on in my mind the Good Samaritan parable is. And then the Prodigal Son Parable is probably up there. I'm not sure if Good Samaritan or Prodigal Son are more well known. I mean, we have a Good Sam hospital here in Cincinnati, so maybe that's well known to people. But this is one of those stories that's well known to people because it's one that people have always looked to as hope. It's kind of like people hear this story and they think to themselves, if this son that went off the range can come back and be redeemed, anybody can. I can be redeemed. And there's no doubt in my mind that that is a part of what Jesus is teaching in this story. But as we've been looking at the parables and we've been thinking about the rhyme and reason of parables, how they function, how they're styled, what the parts mean, we've realized that parables not only are multifaceted in the way they're told, because they have both realistic elements and outrageous elements. They're simple yet complex. And even in their meaning, they can sometimes have one meaning or they can have a variety of different meanings. And sometimes they can have both one meaning and a variety of meanings at the same time, depending on the audience hearing them. Because as we established in one of the weeks, Jesus probably told some variation of these parables multiple times in different contexts to different groups of people. And these parables show up in our Gospels, and we have 4 different Gospels, 3 of which contain a lot of parables, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And some of them we see the same parable with little nuanced differences and in different settings that they're being told. And because of that variability, that creates yet another audience for the parable, and that's the people that receive the Gospels from the people that originally wrote them as communities to whom they were written to. And then we kind of make up what I said was a third audience, and that's anybody that reads the parable that wasn't in Jesus' initial audience when they first heard him saying them, or the party that's not involved in the early church that received these Gospels when they were first written. Because as I always like to say about the Bible, and specifically the New Testament, and even more specifically about the Gospels, they were texts that were not written to us, but they are written for us. And so they mean something for us, but we need to figure out what they meant to the original recipients in order to best discern what they mean for us, and that's the same is true there for parables. And so the reason I told you that this parable is out of order and that's a little bit wonky is that, this is actually funny because in our message series planning, we actually kept these in order. So last week, Dee Dee did the Prodigal Son Parable, and this coming week, we're going to look at the Shrewd Manager Parable on Sunday that we just looked at last Thursday in here. So, and the reason is because that's the order that they go in Scripture. And this one falls kind of in the middle, but because of its familiarity, I wanted to save it for last so that we can look at it with fresh eyes and maybe draw out more of the meaning than we normally ascribe. And the way I want to start doing that, oh, and by the way, we'll go through our questions that we've been going through as these have been case studies, but One of the things I want to point out that I'm going to ruin tonight is a kind of common popular reading of this parable. How many of you won't want to answer this because I'm going to ruin it, but I'll ask anyway. How many of you that have read this parable before have made the assumption that the father in the parable represents God? Anybody? Nobody? All right. Well, there you go. You all didn't get duped. No, I'm just kidding. But if you're at home, you might have been. And guess what? I've been duped before. That's how I always read this, and that's how I always have heard it taught. People like to take parables, and it's a common method for interpreting, and they try to make the characters in the parable a type or a representative for something greater. And so the father in the story is God, and the sons, the wayward son represents the people of faith that were astray, but they repented and they come back. And then the son that stuck with his father but then gets mad at the end of the story, people always assume represents maybe the Pharisees or the Jewish people that didn't follow Jesus at the time. But as we're going to discover tonight, there's a problem with that reading. And it's a pretty profound theological problem. Does God lose things? If you're at home watching online, our friends here in the room are shaking their head no. And they're right, yet again. God does not lose things. And so the moment we see a father lose his son, and dare I say lose two sons, we'll talk about that too, we have a problem if we start comparing the father of this story as a one-for-one to God, which means that ends up breaking down that typical interpretation of the parable. And if that breaks down, then we have to ask, well, then what is the parable supposed to mean? And so what's important is that we look at the context that this parable was done in. And there's something interesting in Luke 15, and that is that Jesus tells 3 parables in a row of lost things. When you read Luke 15, he tells a story about a lost sheep. You may have heard that one before, you know. The shepherd leaves the 99 to go find the one missing. And then there's someone that loses a coin, a lady that loses a coin. And she turns up everything upside down to go find that one lost coin out of 10. And then we have this story about a father losing track of his son. And so why would Jesus tell these stories in sequence like this? And you have to go back a little bit, and we will read this particular parable here in a moment, but you have to go back a little bit to about Luke 14:25. And in Luke 14:25, the text tells us that Jesus has a large crowd following him. And the crowd, Luke says, is made up of sinners and tax collectors. And it also says it's made up of Pharisees and teachers of the law. And we later find out after some of these parables that there's another group of people that is in a part of this large crowd, and that is Jesus' disciples. And Jesus' disciples may represent just the 12. Sometimes in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they specify the 12 to refer to the 12 that Jesus called as apostles or whatever. But they were part of Jesus' disciples. But it also could have been the disciples as a larger collective of people, because we all know Jesus had more than just 12 disciples following him around, made up of men and women. And so we're not sure which group exactly was being referred to, if it was just the 12 or if it was the larger group of disciples. But there's a large crowd. And so it's an interesting thing, because when Luke does this, he says that a large crowd is following Jesus. And what does Jesus decide to tell the crowd about? Well, he decides to tell them about the cost of discipleship. It's kind of like, yeah, I see I'm able to get a lot of people following me. You all like my teaching. Probably heard I healed Mary, Paul, and Joseph over here. And Zebediah over there, he was blind, now he sees again. You liked that, now you're following me. Let me tell you why you should rethink following me. That's kind of what Jesus, he has a knack for that. He gets people that follow, and then he says something outrageous, and people are like, I'm not so sure I like this guy anymore. But what Jesus ends up doing is, he ends up teaching about the cost of discipleship. And in response to his discussion about that and the hardships and the demand of discipleship, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they start prodding Jesus a little bit. And they start muttering under their breath, yeah, this man, he eats with sinners and tax collectors. Just not becoming of a rabbi, not becoming of some religious leader to follow. And that's the context that Jesus tells these parables of lost things. And so, again, Jesus does the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the one we're going to look at here, the parable of the prodigal son. And the reason we picked this one, aside from it being famous, is it's the most robust of the parables. The other two are relatively short. This one gives us more narrative detail than the others. And so I'm going to read it, and then we're going to go ahead and look at what this might mean, given the questions we keep asking each week on parables, after having considered the backdrop in which Jesus tells these short stories. So this is what it says. It says, Jesus continued because he's already told two parables of lost things. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed a fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours.' But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So it's a pretty compelling story. Before we get into all the questions and the context and the meaning, even when you hear that story, if you have a family at all, if you can relate to being a child or a parent, or have anyone close to you in your life, and distance created or being reunited, and all of the emotions that can go into this story, it's a pretty compelling story. It's one thing for Jesus to tell the story of the sheep and the coin being lost. I think, what was it Dee did? He talked about his incredibly structured system for not losing his keys on Sunday, which was funny because I missed his run through the Thursday before the beginning of it. And I mentioned to Aaron Adams, and I said, I was like, oh, this reminds me of losing your keys. And Aaron was like, yeah, Dee going to use that exact example. And I was like, oh, I guess Dee and I are alike. And then I found out how rigorous his system is to not lose his keys. And I was like, we're nothing alike at all. So I'm just kidding. We have 2 sets of keys. This one's my car, and that's Angie's. And Leo doesn't drive yet, so he's only 2, so he's not quite there yet. But anyway, we don't have enough keys to have that kind of system. But anyway, the point is, we can all relate to losing a precious item. When I was a kid, I had dogs. I grew up with dogs, and we had one that when she was old and getting bad off, she ran away. I know what it's like as a kid to go try to find your dog that ran off, and whatnot. So we can relate to those things, and not to minimize them. I love my dogs still. I will be crushed when they pass. Hopefully it doesn't come too soon because they're old. But anyway, that's beside the point. It's not quite as emotionally pulling as thinking about the relationship that you have with people that are important to you in your life. So it's no wonder that it seems like Jesus upped the ante as he told these parables in sequence. And we know that he did these in sequence, at least in the report that Luke has, or Luke styled it that way, because we don't get a break-in at the beginning of this parable where it says, then the other day, Jesus then told this parable, or as he moved on to this other place, it says he continued. I know we normally gloss over those little details, but it's important to see that the way Luke tells this narrative, Jesus has told these 3 parables in sequence. And it's not surprising because, again, the Pharisees have muttered under their breaths, this man eats with sinners and tax collectors. What kind of rabbi is this? Is their mentality here? And so Jesus tells them 3 in a row. He's really trying to lay into them here with these, which is really important to keep in mind. So this is an emotionally pulling parable, and we've laid out these questions each week, and so we'll go through and I'll try to stick to this, but there might be details that we didn't put in the notes here that I'll add in here as I'm thinking about them. But our first question, as it's been, is what were the surrounding circumstances that led to the use of this parable? I opened up with this one, the larger context in Luke, Jesus talking about the cost of discipleship, that he tells these 3 parables in a successive sense, and that he's doing this in light of the religious leaders, which we didn't note there, but the religious leaders in that context are mumbling about Jesus and complaining about who he keeps company with, and that's the context that he does this. So how might Jesus' audience have responded to this parable? And the first thing that we have here in this paragraph, this bullet here, is this idea that Jesus' audience might have been shocked at the idea of each of the 3 lead characters losing something of value. And the reason we say that is, going back to the example of keys, since Dee used it and I admitted that I have a similar, when we lose something, if we misplace something, if we put our wallet somewhere, ladies, if you have a purse and you can't remember, or if you hung it on the door or in the closet, or you lose your keys, or oh my gosh, we all have these little devices these days. Oh, I left my phone inside the other room. We panic. But we also are pretty flippant about our stuff today because, quite frankly, we have an overabundance of stuff in our country. Even if you're not as well off, you're likely doing better than the world around you if you live in this country. And we're all likely doing better than people throughout history have done. As much as it feels like the world is in shambles, there's a lot of truth to the reality that's one of the greatest times to be alive in terms of quality of life and things like that. Even saying that during the middle of a pandemic, we often take for granted the things that we have is the point that I'm making here. And so, we can relate to losing something and frantically searching for it because maybe we got to get out the door and we need our keys. But for a culture that has less than, for an audience of Jesus that doesn't have much to their name, that's wondering where their next meal's going to come, whose every animal that's part of their livestock is vitally important to their life well-being, who wouldn't have much money to their name. It wouldn't have been as commonplace for people like that to be so flippant and loosey-goosey with their stuff. And so, to Jesus' audience, these people in the story that he tells, their first thought is, man, how did the shepherd lose his sheep? Or, you only got 10 coins. I'd kill to have 10 coins. How do you lose one of them? Or worse yet, a man has only 2 sons. How do you lose track of your sons? I mean, in that story alone, what father's given their inheritance and letting their kid just run out and squander it? I mean, this was a culture where, family ties and people under one roof and just the relationship dynamics. Today we think about a kid growing up and going off and doing their own thing, and that's, we're all about independence and everything. Not in this culture. So, these people would have heard these stories and be like, what are these people doing, losing these vitally important things, these precious items, these precious children? So that would be one shocking element to this. And we have a note here, even though we're only reading and focusing on the prodigal son, we have a note here that the parable of the lost sheep, they would have been appalled at the notion of leaving behind such a vast quantity of valuable possessions to find one. So not only would there be shock at the misplaced, but then if you were to go so far as to lose one sheep, and you're able to lose one that easily, you would think they would hunker down and make sure the other 99 stay safe. So that would have been audacious for the people. They would have been shocked that a woman with 10 valuable coins would lose one. And finally, as we noted here, that they would be appalled that a father would give one of his sons his inheritance early and not even keep track of what he's doing with it. And then we have a note here that says that then leave his other son out of the celebration. So, when I said at the beginning here that this father really loses 2 sons or loses track of 2 sons, we don't often read it that way because many of us have heard the interpretation I laid out at the beginning. The father's God. Here's the wayward one. These are the goody two-shoes Pharisees, but it's the bad one that's going to have grace, and then the Pharisees aren't going to like it, and that's how we read the story. That's not what's going on here. The father loses track of 2 sons. The father's wanting to celebrate so much, you would think the first person he'd invite in, his older brother. He has to find out from one of his father's hired servants, which is an interesting disparity in the story, right? Because the younger son that squanders the wealth and comes back, he says, I'm not even worthy to be called your son. Just let me be one of your servants. And then the older son has to find out from one of the servants that the son has come back. It's a funny little detail Jesus uses there. So again, Jesus' initial audience would have just been flabbergasted by the way Jesus is setting up these stories, both at the irresponsibility of the main characters in the story, but also the outrageousness of the find, so to speak, and the way that people celebrate. And the reason that might have been a bit outrageous is because, and this will hone into where we're going to go in terms of the landing spot of the meaning here. When people and culture get lost, it would have probably been believed that it was because they were sinful and got what they deserved. And there's no reason to blemish yourself or risk your own ritual purity or what have you to go get yourself enmeshed with those kinds of people. That was a sign of their disobedience to God, and the people that aren't lost are the people that stayed obedient, and their well-off state is a sign of their good standing with God, including the Pharisees, who are in prime elite positions in their own right here, which is why they're looking down their nose at Jesus, because really for them the problem with Jesus is that they think he should be like him. You'll notice that even though the Pharisees scoff at, ridicule, persecute Jesus, they never fail to call him rabbi. There's no doubt that they see him as someone that's wise, that knows his stuff. Dare I say, they see him as their equal. But when he does things like eating with sinners and tax collectors, well, he's ruining the good name of the religious elite by going with the riffraff when good Pharisees, good rabbis even don't do that sort of thing. They'd rather him do all the things that they do the way that they do it. So that's how Jesus' audience might have initially responded to the parable. How might the Gospel's recipients, how would the Gospel of Luke's original audience maybe have heard or responded to this parable when they first heard it? And you've probably noticed some repetition here, but in this one, and that's that they largely probably would have responded in the same way the first hearers did. We always say that because while we're talking about quite a few years removed, we're still talking about first century culture and first century notions about life. So it's not like today when we read these stories as citizens of the United States in 2021. This would be more akin to, we're even far removed from 1776 and things in our own country in terms of time and space and the way we live. So these folks would have been a good generation or so removed from Jesus' initial hearers, very likely. But some that had a really good luck of the draw in terms of life expectancy might have made it past to this point and might still be in this crowd. But the sensibilities and the lifestyle wouldn't have been much different. So we always want to note that there would be people that would have responded or heard in the same way. And yet we have here that they would have the added perspective of experiencing sinners coming to faith in Jesus and entering the church. The stories would encourage them to rejoice in the same way the characters in Jesus' stories do, instead of berating saved sinners for their past. If you are on that side or this side, but further back in time, of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, and you're a follower of Jesus, you're in the Christian community, you may even be a Jewish Christian, but you are not thinking in the same frame of mind that the Jewish people that would have heard Jesus would be thinking. Your religious and worldview sensibilities would have changed by that point. And so they would have applied maybe a more salvation and grace-oriented understanding to the parable than maybe just original hearers would have. So with those two in mind, how might Jesus' audience have responded, and the gospel recipients? Now we want to ask, how might each of these groups been convicted by the parable? We noted this last week, but I'll bring it up again. Then in Luke 16:14, after Jesus tells the parable of the shrewd manager, that the Pharisees reflect on all of the parables they just heard from Jesus, not just the shrewd manager one, but all of them. And they took issue with Jesus. It says they scoffed at him. In fact, Luke adds a little note that they were lovers of money. And, that issue, they were lovers of wealth, had less to do probably with them being money hungry and more to do, again, with status and what money represented or wealth represented in terms of right standing versus sinfulness. They had an image to keep up with. We're the leaders. We have to look the part. I hate to say this, but I'll use it. Oftentimes there's the scriptural precept or precedent to live above reproach. Have you ever heard that phrase before? And it's well-meaning, living above the fray, if you're going to lead, James constantly says if you're going to teach, you better watch yourself because you're going to be judged more highly. But oftentimes what we do is we take this idea of living above reproach, and instead of actually living above reproach, it becomes more about image maintenance. And so it's more about looking the part, towing the line. I can think of all sorts of different instances. I can even remember in Bible college hearing about, you better watch yourself in this situation or that because you don't want to be seen doing this or that. And what it ends up amounting to is you end up being more worried about your image maintenance than you are about actually living an obedient life. And sometimes being obedient to God puts you in situations where your image maintenance falls apart. And you have to ask which one's more important. Am I going to be obedient to God or am I going to keep my image up? And so, sadly, when we think about the Pharisees, were concerned about wealth, they felt the need to look the part in order to stay in the position to lead the people. And I think I said a couple weeks ago, and I tend to always say this, there was a good intent there, the idea of leading the people. Even the image maintenance of leaders today, church leaders that go too far with that above reproaching, they have their, it'll sound weird, but they have their heart in the right place. They don't want to, they don't want to fall apart at the expense of causing somebody's faith to fall apart. But the problem, though, is when you play that game, the higher point from which you crash, the more likely you damage the faith of others anyway. And so the better way is to try to be obedient to God and yet to be authentic and honest about who you are, your flaws, and things like that. That's why those of us that do what we do here in preaching and teaching are open about our own struggles and things. Heard me talk about my anxiety issues ad nauseum around here before, because guess what? I have anxiety issues. I'm not just saying it so that it can be a preaching trope. I actually struggle with it. I go to counseling once a month for it. There you go. Now you know something even more. So the point being is that that's what we do. Like I want you to know that I have a struggle, and I want you to know that I do work on it because I care about living out my faith, but I'm not perfect. And so I hope that in my imperfection and striving to live my faith, that I become someone worthy of following, while you imperfect people that are trying to live your faith out can do the same thing and be imperfect and trying to live your faith out like I'm doing. Does that make sense? So we're not worried about the image upkeep thing, and not all Pharisees were probably like that, but the particular ones that were in this large crowd, according to Luke, were. And that becomes problematic if you're with a rabbi like Jesus, who has been seen eating with who? Tax collectors and sinners, people that you don't want to even brush up against, whether you be ridiculed by people. That Pharisee rubbed up shoulders against a prostitute and a tax collector. We can't follow him anymore, So anyway, so that's what's going on here. So the Pharisees took issue with Jesus' parables. So we know that they are a group that did not, Well, let me put it this way. They understood the parables, but they were not convicted by them. And if you remember way back in the beginning, and we've repeated even in our message series that definition of a parable, and the goal is both to understand it and do what? Apply it. So without the conviction after understanding, the incentive to apply to your life is gone. And so the Pharisees, they hear what Jesus is saying, they just don't like it, so they scoff at him. It doesn't change them at all. But as has been the case, when we get zeroed in on one particular group out of the whole large crowd, we know what the Pharisees thought about Jesus' parables, but we don't really know what anybody else thought. We know disciples were there. We know that tax collectors and sinners were there hearing this, but we're not told by Luke what they thought about the parable, how they responded. Sometimes we get the disciples ask Jesus in private what the parables mean. We don't have that this time. So, as is often the case, we have to make an educated guess here. And so, it says, therefore, that while the Pharisees, while angered at the parable, were not convicted to change, some people may have identified with the lost things and have reflected on how, contrary to certain cultural divides, they were to be valued as individuals and to value others too. And this is key. You know, if you were a tax collector or sinner, if you were in that category of people and you were there on the scene and you're hearing these stories, and let's say you understand what Jesus is throwing down here too, the way the Pharisees do, you understand this and apply it to yourself much differently than they do. You now have hope. And Jesus is talking about this idea of something lost being found and a party happening when what is lost is found. And imagine you imagining yourself as a lost individual that is found and being celebrated for being found in a world where nobody notices that you exist, or worse, they do notice and they wish you didn't. You're not accustomed to being celebrated very often. But now you're hearing this Jesus talk about a whole home being turned up and 99 left to go find the one. And it doesn't stop when the thing that's lost is found. A party happens afterward. And the same is true of this lost son that comes back. But also, if you're hearing this, whether you're in the tax collector sinner group, maybe you're a disciple of Jesus, maybe you're just someone that's heard about the spectacle that is Jesus of Nazareth going around teaching and healing, and you want to see and hear more about this rabbi from Nazareth. You might be thinking on both sides of the fence. Maybe you're caught between the Pharisees and then the lost people of the world. Maybe you're thinking like, the Pharisees don't really like this, and they seem like they might be the good guys. Maybe I should pick their point of view, or maybe you're Peter. I don't know if you guys know that in Luke chapter 5 we get the longer version of Peter's story with Jesus, where he tells him to put the boat out on the water after he was teaching, and Peter's there, and they make the miracle catch of fish, and it's Peter that says, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." And Jesus says, "I'm going to make you fish for people." Maybe you're Peter in this audience and you think yourself a sinful man, unworthy to be around Jesus. And maybe you're thinking, I was lost and I was found, and maybe I need to view the lost people that I once was in a more valuable and different light than I have. Because I don't know about you all, but I'm a church person, and you all might be church people, and you online at home might be church people. And maybe, just maybe, you've forgotten what it was like to be a lost person. And now you're one of the church people, and now you're one of the religious people. You're on the good side, and you forget. And maybe you've started devaluing other people that aren't so found yet. And so Jesus is challenging those people in the crowd too. which I know I just kind of brought in our last question with that, but we'll get back to that in a second. How might the gospel's recipients have been convicted by the parable? Well, some of the recipients may have realized that they were condescending toward those who had entered the church differently than they had. Why do I say that? Well, for instance, I don't know if you know this, but the big issue of the early church was the Jewish-Gentile skirmish. If you were a Jewish person, the Messiah came for you. They were here to rescue you from the clutches of all your oppressors, both spiritual and worldly, and things were going to go well for you from here on out. You were already in the in crowd, and the Messiah has come for your benefit. But then you find out, and you have to come to grips with this idea that God had a plan bigger than you, and he was going to go to the people outside of the in crowd and bring them in too. And yet the people on the outside of the in crowd do things like outside of the in crowd people do. You catch what I'm getting at? And so you have to start thinking in terms of, well, how do we reconcile this? We're different. Don't we have to be the same? Shouldn't we make these people do what we're doing? And so that became the thing. Jewish followers of Jesus started trying to pin the religious rites and passages and things like that of their Judaism on Gentile, non-Jewish people that became followers of Jesus. And we know this was a big deal. Peter and Paul got into it with each other. Paul talks about that in his letter to the Galatians. And so you're hearing this parable of lost things being found and celebrated, and here you are, you're not too sure you want to let these Gentiles be part of your group. I'd say this parable will be pretty convicting to you. And by the way, the Luke that wrote the book of Acts is the one that's writing this gospel that this parable is in. So you know he has in mind that issue of Jewish people and Gentiles having tension in the early church. And so some of them may have been convicted by that reality and decided, I got to wise up, and I've got to open my heart. I've got to find kindness. I've got to do this thing that they probably heard over and over again, and I know that because we hear it over and over again in the New Testament. It's called love one another. There's a bunch of passages about loving one another in the New Testament. So it was a common phrase in the early church, and they were probably convicted. So we've got that one. And then yet in some instances, church authorities wanted them to be welcomed with open arms, no strings attached, as parables encourage. So you not only might have been convicted, or you might have understood the parable and received it in a bit of a not so open manner, and yet you're seeing your church leaders do something that you're not for. You think, no, this gospel, this Messiah is for me and not for them. And what business these leaders here, they might have been with Jesus, but they must have missed the plot somewhere. And the people on the other side might have thought the same thing about that. So that's how they might have been convicted or might have understood the parable. And of course, our most important landing spot for us today as that third audience is, what lessons can we draw from this parable and how can we apply them to our lives? Well, this was the theme of the sermon this past Sunday, but we should rejoice when a sinner is saved and not show contempt toward them due to their past. Now, we write that in the bullet point here, and the truth is that I can't think in all my years of anyone, although, I can't be inside the mind of people, but I've never seen anyone get up and object to a baptism when we've done it in church the same way someone might object to a wedding ceremony or something like that, like you see in the movies. So I don't know how often someone immediately shows contempt toward people due to their past. But that being said, it may not be the moment of conversion that people might object to it. It might be the idea of that person in your past that's starting to change in a good way, and they found Jesus, and you knew their past and kind of didn't want them to find Jesus because kind of wanted them to get what they deserved. That ever ring a bell for anybody? Anybody else? Anyone online ever have that kind of grudge with people? I don't know. I've told this in different spots and sermons before, but I was a scrawny kid and I got picked on sometimes. We would use the term bullied today, and I don't really like when people make light of bullying, but I also don't think that has to be your the makeup of your life. I got pushed down, kicked, never wanted to be in the bathroom stall and someone else ever came in. But anyway, that's beside the point. You experience things that aren't real fun if you get picked on in school as a kid. I'll never forget the first couple times I had people that were bullies to me show up in church when I was preaching. And I had that brief moment of like, what are you doing here? And I didn't say it out loud because I was focusing on preaching. I got over it. I was glad eventually that I saw them. But I tell you that from experience. I know what it's like to kind of think, God rescued me and he got me past those things, those hurts in my life, and here I am today. But those people that did it, I hope they get theirs. And then suddenly God starts doing something in their life and the whole plan is ruined. So we should rejoice when a sinner is saved. And more than a sinner being saved, because we talk about that in a very one-off situation, but I should say when someone that is far from God becomes a follower of Jesus and devotes their life to following him and turn their life back to God. I'm not just talking about a one-off, but something that reshapes their whole being. We should rejoice when what's lost is found, even if it's someone we didn't want to have found. The second one here is just because you used to be lost doesn't mean you can't become a person who loses people or a person who shows contempt when people are found. What? Well, we've already been nodding along to that concept, but this is where I kind of fulfill the ruining of these parables. I said that the Father can't represent God because God doesn't lose things. Who loses things? People do. See, what Jesus has done with this parable is he's challenging the Pharisees who have determined that they are in right standing with God, and those that are following in their footsteps are right with God, and everyone else on the outskirts of that, those that would be included in the lost sheep of Israel fold, they're gone. We don't have time to focus on that. In fact, if we do focus on that, if we do brush up against that, it actually might taint us. Again, it's taking another scriptural kind of precedent and going too far with it. You've heard the idea, bad company corrupts, good morals sort of thing. Don't be of the world, but you can't be taken out of the world. You still have to live within it, and we are still called to love people that aren't on the inside of the faith. And so you can't live your life viewing other people as untouchable just to keep yourself untouched by sin or devastation or brokenness. If anything, we learn from Jesus through the theological term incarnation, the idea of God coming in the flesh and dwelling amongst us. If we have a God worthy of getting down into the dirt and grime of this broken world, we should be willing to be in the dirt and grime and brokenness of people around us so that we can find what is lost and celebrate. And yet too often, when we are people that used to be lost, we kind of make the assumption that we can't possibly lose people. But if I were to ask you to close your eyes right now and think about not only individuals, but maybe people groups that you overlook, that you marginalize, that you forget about in this world, you would have to be honest and say, yeah, I guess I can lose people pretty easily. I can. We all can. And so being found and brought onto the inside doesn't make us capable of losing people, and it doesn't make us free of the potential to show contempt when people are found. And that's a convicting thought. The third bullet here says that Jesus may be convicting us by asking us this: if you can't even keep track of all your material things, what makes you think you could never lose a person? So if you're of the mind that I can't overlook people, that I can't marginalize people, that I can't devalue people, look at how easy it is to lose something you don't want to lose. Now think about the people in your life that maybe aren't on your inner circle. Maybe they don't occupy these seats here. How easy it is for them to remain lost because you don't have your eyes open looking so that you can celebrate when they are found. Which is why I think Jesus ramps up the stories the way that he does and ends with the story of lost sons. Because it would be easy to at least confess, even if you think it's belligerent to have lost something so valuable like a sheep or a coin, you at least could maybe reconcile that, but I would never lose my children. I would never lose my friend. I would never lose my family member. I would never lose this person or that person. I'm easily capable of losing my phone, so I guess I actually could lose a person in some way, shape, or form. The last bullet we have here, and we've got Bible texts for reference here that set up more context to, to some of these parables here. But just because we've heard a parable many times before and think we understand it doesn't necessarily mean that we do. We should approach the parables in other Bible passages with an openness to the text, because while the text is divinely inspired, our various interpretations are not. There's a fun, shocking one to end on. Didn't see that one coming, did you? Yeah, it's the whole thing, we forget how our own theological doctrines work, and then we try to overstep our boundaries. And so we misinterpret something, or we miss a detail somewhere, and we think we've got it, and we're missing a greater and more important lesson from a story. And lo and behold, we start telling everyone it has to be the way that I think that it is. And then we tag on, because Scripture is inspired, and you better agree with my interpretation because it's inspired, and I read the inspired word, and this is what I think about it, and therefore my thought's inspired. Even though no one would ever with a right face say that, that's how we oftentimes talk about the Bible. If we were all honest, we would get up, and anytime we tell someone a Bible story, we would have to add an end-user agreement that no one ever reads when they get, buy something online, and you got to scroll through that page and hit accept. And the end user agreement and all those terms would say, by the way, you've just agreed to my interpretation and not really what the Scripture might have originally intended to say, because, by the way, it wasn't even in English in the first place. So anyway, we land on that because that takes us back to the beginning of this idea of parables here, and that is understanding them in context and recognizing that one of the ways to get to a more right or more thorough interpretation of Jesus' short stories is to have humility and to be willing to put in the work, the prayer, and the reliance on the Spirit to get to a more right and robust interpretation. And this story that we ended with happens to be one of the ones that people think they've tied all the characters to the right people, and therefore they've got the right interpretation, and they've moved on, and they won't hear it another way. But the reality is if you're reading the parable of the prodigal son and just reading yourself into the shoes or sandals of the prodigal son, which means you're the good guy because you get found and a party gets thrown for you, and you're not convicted by the message that God celebrates when something is lost is found, and that you, like the older son, could be someone that chooses not to celebrate when something is lost is found, and might not even recognize that you also, because we barely talked about this one, are also lost. Because your father forgot about you when your brother came home, and you were so mad that you were forgotten that you couldn't even call him your brother. You said, that son of yours. If we miss those details in the story and don't read it in context, we're missing out on an opportunity to not only understand the parable on Jesus' terms, to not only be convicted by it, but most importantly, to actually apply it to our lives. If God is in the business of his people embracing what is lost, finding it, and celebrating with the angels in heaven when what is lost is found, then we should open our eyes to the actual meaning of this parable of two lost sons and recognize how capable we are of being lost, how capable we are of losing precious things, and how important it is for us to be open to finding what is lost and celebrating with God. And if we just gloss over this parable like we already know it, we miss a great opportunity to grow in faith. So that's that parable, and that's our intro to the parables for these seminar. Any questions? I don't know if there's any questions online. My phone hasn't buzzed in my pocket. I think Aaron's watching from home. There's one simple explanation and one more complex. The simple one, which probably has some merit to it, is that when we preach a sermon for 30 minutes on a Sunday, you kind of have to pick an angle and then hope you come back to the parable the next time and hit the other angle next time. Of course, the way message series and the bigness of the Bible are, you don't know when you're going to come back around to that story again. And so time tends to permit, and so you're thinking, well, where are our people at, and which emphasis do I need to make on this story? And add to that, the emphasizing the lost son that returns to the father is not only the more emotionally pulling one, but it's the one that especially a lot of church people that maybe didn't grow up in church relate to. We've all heard the testimony from the person that was in a biker gang and, shot two dogs when they were a kid and did every drug on the book, and then suddenly their bike flipped over on the road and they saw a great light and they realized the light was coming from that church, and they walked in and they gave their life over, and suddenly they were a different person. Some of that was a little extreme, but you get the point. We've all heard those stories, right? Those are the stories that sell, and those are also the stories that are really powerful, because it's amazing and awesome when someone going so far that direction turns the opposite direction to God. But the reality is, a lot of people's lives aren't really that extreme. And sometimes they need to hear about that older son, because their life is actually kind of more over here already, except they haven't embraced the grace that this person that was at their limit embraced because of the extremeness of what they were pulled out of. Maybe they just assume that they're always good. Maybe they resent that this biker guy ended up showing up here in the first place. Maybe it's because the biker guy's story is so good that this person that's in this church family over here that's lived everything right has done everything right for so long, and no one cared at all that they existed, and now this guy that's never stepped foot shows up because he saw the light coming off the porch of the church, and now he gets to get up and tell his testimony, and little Johnny Do-Good still isn't noticed. just like the son in the story. And in the same way that the person that's on the outside can be devalued by people on the inside, it's very easy for us to actually lose track of the very people sitting next to us in the seats inside the church, which is a harder lesson to stomach. And that's the more complex answer to why we don't always hear about the older son. Because there's a lot of us, I'm going to include myself, even though I didn't properly grow up in church, in the sense of go since I was a wee little lad on up. But, I always tell I didn't grow up in church, but the reality is I'm 37 and I started coming here when I was 15 or 16. So more than half my life I've been a church person, so I much more relate to the older son. I admitted to you before that I had older son feelings when seeing someone I didn't want to see show up in the building before. And so for me, the older son in the story is equally as convicting as the tale of the younger son. But the one that we really don't hear preached on properly is the father in the story. Because we often hear the father relates to God, so we're just going to let him be. Dude, he gave his son all of his inheritance and let him go do whatever he wants. And then when he comes back, he lets him in without so much as even a word, and then forgets the other brother in the picture. I mean, you want to talk about an absentee dad in this story? Like, I hate to be a jerk, but that's kind of how this person plays out. And yet, Jesus has managed to use an imperfect father to make a point about the importance of celebrating something lost being found. And so the reality is that we often don't have permission when we hear this story told by preachers to relate to the father, because we assume the father represents God and we can't relate to God because it's, But if we actually allow the father to just be a father that's misplaced his two children, well, all of a sudden we can relate to that really easily. Heck, my kid's 2 years old. If I even turn my back for 2 seconds, he could be climbing something, and I didn't even see it. Anyway, so there's relatability all around, actually. And that's the point, because remember, we said these parables don't always just have one singular meaning. They may be trying to get you to see multiple angles of a problem that's existing in your world or in the world in general. And so Jesus uses 3 different people to talk about 3 different angles of this problem of people being devalued when God actually values them. And so, yeah. And by the way, the old son's really mean to his dad, because he should be really glad that dad's actually showing excitement that his kid was found, since his dad was so good at losing them in the first place. Because we often do that, don't we? We can't ever celebrate when someone turns the corner on something they've been bad at. We have to keep a record of wrongs. I think the Bible says something about don't keep a record of wrongs. It's in that 1 Corinthians 13 passage about love, right? Yeah. So the older son shouldn't have been like, yeah, Dad, you're a jerk. This son of yours comes back after hanging out with prostitutes, and you wouldn't even give me a goat. He should have said, Dad, you have overlooked me and my brother for so long, and I am just glad that you are different now. But he didn't. Anyway, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he would never. Yeah, he was the young son was starving. Says he wanted to eat from the pods of the pigs, and yep. Yeah, he didn't. Yeah, and that's the other thing. And the funny thing about Jesus' parables is we often try to look for a good guy in the story, so we turn the young son into a good guy, but oftentimes Jesus tells parables where there's not really much of a good guy. Like, the only parable I can think of where there's a quasi-legitimate good guy is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, who, by the way, the good guy in that story does not have a good life, if you go read that parable. It's like, do I really want to be a good guy in life? Because it doesn't seem in Jesus' stories like they fare all that well. They're sitting there poor, hungry, and having their wounds licked by dogs. Sounds like I want to be righteous, which, by the way, is a different stature if you think that being righteous plays itself out by you having a bunch of wealth. But anyway, that's a different parable, so we won't talk about that one right now. But the point is that, yeah, the young guy, there isn't really a good guy proper in the story. There's not someone that starts out at the beginning of the scene and you're like, that's the hero of this film. I'm going to follow him and hope that he wins in the end. You've got a greedy young son that goes and blows his wealth on disgusting, frivolous things, and he only comes back when he can't eat pig slop to his dad, and comes up with some lame line, "Oh, Dad, I'm not even your son. I'm just a slave. Please give me something to eat." And he comes up with the thing, and Dad, because he's aloof and loses his sons, falls for it. He gives them a party, and then the other son that actually was, for whatever reason, obedient to this dad, because most people wouldn't want to be because the dad's aloof, he's mad at Dad now because Dad wouldn't pay attention to him. It's just not a good family to be in. And yet Jesus makes his point using that. So I've just ruined the whole parable for you by that last little bit there. You'll never be able to read it the same again, and therefore I've done my job. No, I'm just kidding. So, any other questions? Anything else? David, did we have any questions from the online viewers, listeners? No? Shaking your head no? No. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to pray, and I'll close this out. God, thank you for tonight. Thank you for allowing us yet another evening to study your word, to reflect on the challenge that is understanding the parables, but the even greater challenge of being convicted by them and applying them to our lives. I pray, God, that you will help us to do that as we go about our lives, and help us to keep our eyes open and our humility upright as we approach your scriptures and your other parables in those scriptures, so that we can learn from them, understand them, be convicted by them, and apply them to our lives as well. And it's in your Son, Jesus' name, that we pray. Amen. Thank you all for being here each week. I really do appreciate it. Thank you online. And I will say, we don't have a firm date, but sometime in the first quarter of 2022, we will do our next one of these, and it'll be a 4-week one on the Old Testament law as it is relevant, or is it relevant to Christians today. And we will, just to really give you a cliffhanger and make you excited, we are going to hit some hot button issues in that one. So it'll be fun.